Okay, so good morning and welcome to KMK's first roundtable discussion. These roundtable events are being provided to the pharmaceutical community on an ongoing basis to share our experiences and some of the innovative ideas that have been coming out of our teams for both emerging as well as mature pharmaceutical firms. A little bit about KMK Consulting. We focus exclusively in the pharmaceutical industry, and we have practices devoted to sales operations, market research, HOR, as well as a complement of business intelligence tools for the field force. We've been in business for over 20 years, and we partner with emerging, mid-size, and mature pharmaceutical companies. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of having a flexible sales force and the advantages that this model can provide in the current business environment, given with COVID and some of the major upheaval that we've seen these days. Today, I am joined with my colleagues Jing Yu, head of our Salesforce Analytics practice, Greg Chu, principal at KMK, who leads the market research team, and Paul Johnson, founder of Ignite and Flourish, and subject matter expert on the topic of forecasting. Our format today will be to present a case study that provides an example of a successful, flexible sales force, which will be followed by a discussion of this model from our panelists' perspective. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address the questions at the end of our presentation as time permits. I'm going to turn this over to Jing at this point and ask her to walk us through the case study that we'll be discussing. So Jing, can you take it from here?
Definitely. Thank you, Rob. So Salesforce design is definitely a very critical step for product commercialization. However, it's normally not being considered as a very challenging task, especially for experienced commercial leaders. I always hear like CCO or sales VP telling me like, oh, my gut tells me like we need roughly this number of sales reps. And most of the time, like the number is actually pretty accurate. However, COVID-19 just swiftly changed the whole healthcare landscape. Patients, doctors, and payers all start to perform differently in the new norm and start making the product commercialization and field execution to be extremely challenging. So specific for this case study, our client is an emerging pharma preparing for their product launch in early 2021. As we all know, the launch performance for emerging pharma normally determines their fate of the whole company. So when we start doing the Salesforce design conversation, the client basically set very fierce objectives and requirements for us. They need the field force design to achieve a well-balance between financial responsibility, high flexibility to adapt to the upcoming market dynamics, while at the same time, like they don't want to sacrifice any launch success. Like they want to still be able to achieve very robust customer experience right out of launch. And what makes the work even harder for us is most of the primary market research and the secondary data analysis, even including the forecasting model, are all done pre-COVID without considering any of its impact. So instead of purely doing a field force design work, we actually need to first help our client to understand and quantify how COVID will potentially impact their product adoption. So to help answer this question, we leverage primary market research to collect patient, doctors, payers' perception on how COVID will change their future attitude and also behavior toward new products. And we also combine and using secondary data to validate. So we basically analyze like since March timeline, how the COVID has impacted market total utilization, what changes have happened between branded generic adoption, and how is the recovery trajectory looks like for our focus market and for our identified analog product. So all those insights we gained from the primary and secondary data all helps to inform like if our clients expect a second wave. And now we know, like we do really knowing there is a second wave upcoming. So how the short-term and long-term impact will happen for their product. And then we build them all into the original forecast model to help them inform what should be the new revenue forecast range. So another big puzzle really confuses our client is how to make the execution financially sustainable. So our client initially, they really like our proposed phased field launch option, as it really provides them great flexibility for future upscale based on market opportunity, and it also significantly lower their initial financial risk. Well, on the other hand, we also hear a lot of different voices, like people are reluctant to accept the idea because they are worried initial lower target coverage might have catastrophic financial impacts, and also future impacts the relationship, the disruption it happens can also impact their longer term success. So to be able to address this concern, we further expand the forecast model by adding in the promotional effort factors. This allows our client to clearly quantify the revenue and profit implication caused by having different field force size in various time frames. So, and also on the field force design part, we also propose to have different onboarding schedule for different roles, like regional director, like territory manager, and we also tier the territory level and plan for their launch based on product opportunity, COVID regulation at different states, and also their the foreseen market access situation. So this all helps us to ensure our client will still have sufficient focus at launch, while at the same time, we can also help them minimize all the future relationship disruption. So as a result, although COVID still poses a huge uncertainty along the way, with all the effort and insights we are able to acquire through the research analysis, our client, from the initial very uncertain with the future situation, they actually gained great confidence in the assumptions we use to inform the forecasting and sizing, and also felt more aligned, also feel more assured that the phased launch approach and communication strategy we proposed and implemented for them will be able to support their launch success. So this basically concludes my part of the case study. So hope it provides some idea and insights to all the audiences. So Rob, return back to you.
Great, thanks, Jing. That was very insightful. Appreciate that. So here we are in our new world, the virtual panel that we have. We have Greg, Jing, and Paul. Thank you all for joining us today. Paul, I'd like to start with you. When Jing speaks about some of the more catastrophic financial impact that could potentially happen, it seems to me that it all starts with forecasting and getting it right. And she spoke a little bit about how a parameterized model can help drive and make this a little bit more effective. Can you expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the things that we believe very strongly and where we've had a lot of success is in defining a forecast, which obviously feeds into an understanding of the correct sales force size, and also, if done well, can take into account factors such as COVID-19 and future expected impacts from that, is to really have that forecast be completely parameterized. And what I mean by that is every assumption that goes into the forecast, which there are many, some related to access, others relating to perhaps pricing, others related to epidemiology and the growth of the product. And one of those that is, every one of those assumptions being parameter driven, meaning they are dynamically adjustable, so that if any of those assumptions change, rather than having to come back to KMK or myself to have the forecast redone or to change those assumptions, they can be done dynamically. And the forecast is updated automatically by the client directly. So it becomes much more efficient in that way. One of those parameters or assumptions that is often missing from most launch forecasts that I've seen is actually the promotional effort. Clearly, a product launching with 50 reps is going to launch very, very differently than with 100 reps, okay? You're going to have a tremendous amount more business coverage with more reps than with less reps. But of course, that business coverage has diminishing returns, meaning each incremental rep is going to give you more business coverage, but not as much as the last business rep. So where's the optimal size of that? And where does it come into play? And how does all that play in with COVID-19, which is where I really appreciate this case study that Jing has put together here based on some work that we've done with clients to be able to really see that flexibility to be able to bring that in. So in answer to your question, Rob, the whole forecasting approach, yes, that is a basis for being able to really understand the impact of changes that you expect to make in terms of the sales force over time and the impact on the sales that will result from that effort that is delivered.
Thanks, Paul. So that leads me to think about how, especially when we're in COVID, we may not necessarily have the data that we need from standard traditional sources. And I think that's where primary and secondary market research comes into play. Greg, can you talk a little bit about where do you start on that, particularly when in this kind of situation?
Sure. Well, I think, we often have a leg up because we work with people like Paul and with forecasting models that start to point us to the key parameters or key issues that are going to be impacting sales performance. And although there are any number of parameters that we might look at for general forecasting issues, I think Paul highlighted one of the ones that has been particularly important within the COVID world, which of course is promotional effort. And for our part on market research, what we look at, for example, through surveys, is to really understand how stakeholders are providing or not able to provide access to sales representatives, for example. We recently completed a study for a hospital product. Obviously, hospitals dramatically affected access both physically and by policy, to find out really, are people continuing to engage with sales reps, maybe if not in person, through other means? What are those means? How has it affected frequency? And also, how do they think things will change over time, or how have they adapted over time, even within COVID? Because how people reacted in the first month or two is different from how they're working things through now. The other issue, which we didn't touch on specifically, but which is important as well, is the demand aspect. So again, within COVID, are people going for procedures that may be viewed as elective when they can put things off? Are there changes in prescription fills, as we saw very early in COVID with a certain amount of, stocking up on drugs as well? Will that continue, etc.? These are all things where the stakeholders' opinions and assessments of what they are doing and what they will do affects things, and we try to capture that through market research.
That's interesting. So I think about this. There's more parameters, there's a lot of data coming in. It's a pretty big effort. And from the client side, I think that they have, they want to understand this or actually more validate the approach. Jing, what's the client reaction, and how do they go about to accept and validate what we're trying to bring to them?
Well, the very best way to actually have them validate the approach is to really implement the plan. Yeah. So it's going to be really challenging, to do anything pre-launch. Sure. So, however, we definitely do something to help our clients to be better informed, with all the decisions, and help them along the way to significantly improve the success rate of this plan. So as we talk about, basically the biggest uncertainty of the whole plan, really impacts the product outcome, is actually how COVID is changing the market dynamics and how exactly it impacts our clients' products. So it is really, really important for our client to, before doing anything, conduct a thorough situation analysis. So these are the things I mentioned. Also, both Paul and Greg mentioned, we need to leverage primary market research and secondary data analysis to just evaluate what risk and difficulties COVID has posed to them and they didn't put into consideration before. So to really determine what key parameters we need to start adding into their models. And then more importantly, it's also Paul mentioned a parameterized model, and what is actually is the scenario planning. So previously, before COVID, people probably are more used to a single point of forecasting, a single point number of size. That's no longer be sufficient for you to really plan for the future uncertainty. So no matter how good is your analysis, no matter how exhaustive you are doing for your market, how many products you're using to analyze, we have to admit that the magnitude of COVID really varies by product and varies by therapeutic area. So we really have to develop various scenarios, conduct a complete exploration of all the possible scenarios. Well, it allows you to feel excited with your top line number. It also protects you and make you be prepared for the bottom line, like to ensure you have a contingency plan in place pre-launch.
Yeah, interesting. So when I think about that, it's a bit of a leap of faith that a client is going to be making. And in terms of the whole design, there's a lot more information that you're going to need to uncover with the client. And Paul, I'm interested in how you have seen this, because I think clients would find this interesting as well. How does this approach differ from the more traditional sales force design that you have done historically?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I do want to take one exception to one thing you said, and that is the concept that it's a leap of faith.
Well,
because quite honestly, it doesn't need to be a leap of faith. It needs to be more an understanding of what you're needed to believe, okay? And so when you look at that and you look at the scope of that and how it compares to traditional model, I can give a very specific example that I think helps you to kind of understand that. In the last section of the case study that Jing presented, she mentioned a little bit about 3 different types of territories that are identified as you're going through and expanding into a much more flexible rollout in terms of a flexible sales force. So there's a lot of different areas that come into play there. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the parameterized forecast, building in to the forecast the actual promotional effort. So you can actually see the impact on the forecast from different levels of promotional effort. But some of the other areas that of course are impacted is obviously the targeting, the alignments themselves. How do you actually cut the territories? And if you're launching a new field force in the face of COVID. And so as a very specific example here, in a traditional approach, the way an alignment is generally cut is you get a sales force size number that comes out, okay? And management agrees and sets their numbers. For example, they may come up and say, okay, we need 120 representatives, okay? So then they'll run an optimizer, and in that optimizer, they'll create 120 territories across the country with a couple of parameters in mind, keeping workload balanced between all the territories and basically cutting each of those territories to have an equality of workload while not having too much travel distance, et cetera. Then those territories will be grouped into districts, those districts will be grouped into regions, and voila, you have an alignment that you review with the sales team and with the leadership of the company. That's a more traditional approach. What we're talking about here is a very different approach for the alignment as in this example. So what we'll do here is we look at the impact of the forecast. We still come up with an estimate, but we come up with a range on that estimate as opposed to a single number. So we may come up with a range of saying, well, you need to launch at least with around 100 reps, but it could be as high as 130 if there were no COVID issues and we didn't think there was going to be any problems in the future and everything was open and running perfectly and there wasn't any more phases and the vaccine worked perfectly, we'd probably be up around that 130 number. But in reality, we have some areas of the country that are impacted more than others. So what we do is we first start and identify the number of regions we would need, regardless within that range of whether we're at 100 or 130. So for example, we may end up saying, well, we're going to have 2 regions, okay? And that's going to be fixed under either scenario. But then we need to decide the number of districts. But what we often do there is we say, well, the districts, we're actually going to cut those after cutting the regions. So instead of starting the territory and building our way up, we're doing the opposite. We're starting the high level and building our way down. So then we actually identify the number of districts on the higher end of that. So for example, you may end up with, if you had 130 total is your ideal number, you may end up with 13 districts, 1 region with 7, 1 region with 6 as an example. And then you're able to go in and start saying, well, let's go ahead and not fill out all 130 territories at launch because of the impacts we know short-term are with COVID, but we're going to actually fill out and place within each of those districts a smaller span of control than we would ideally have in the long term. Now, what that does for you is you're able to launch with a smaller number of reps, but then the adding of additional reps becomes very, very flexible. Because if one area of the country that you didn't expect to get hit hard all of a sudden picks up and gets hit really hard, you don't expand there as quickly. And you're not having to cause a cascade of disruption across the country to change the sales force size, but you can do it district by district and can expand according to the needs of the expanded opening and the access could change, et cetera. There's a lot of variables that can come in that allow you to be able to very flexibly move up to that 120 or 130 number that you ideally like to get to versus the 100 number that you started at, okay? So then what you're able to do is you start with a little bit lower span of control. You start to dynamically and very methodically increase that area by area, depending upon exactly how things are opening up. And actually implementing this, the reception by clients has been very, very positive. And again, the reason why is because it gives tremendous amount of flexibility to not over staff or to over have too many representative launch with a high cost, but at the same time to be able to flex it and dynamically build that up over time. So hopefully that helped to give more of a concrete answer to your question.
It does. I think that gives a real world basis for what you really mean by flexible. So that's helpful. And when I listen to all that, it sounds like a lot of the data is driving this, and it's real important to have information that's pretty continuous and pretty germane to the situation at hand. So Greg, I think about this when a client maybe has certain preconceived notions. You go out and you do a particular study and you come back and you may have a surprise. How do you do, and how do you fit into this kind of model? How does that help?
Yeah, I think one of the things I love about market research is what we might call the Forrest Gump effect. It's really kind of sometimes like a box of chocolates. You're never sure what you're going to get. I mean, very often you kind of can't anticipate the results, but there are surprises. And I think what's really important is keeping an open mind to those surprises, because very often we're guided by mental models of how the world works, which may be either dated or based on false assumptions. This is the way the world was pre-COVID, or maybe this is the way the world was as we learned in the immediate months after the start of COVID. But there's learning, and people behave differently over time, and things can change over time. And I think, Jing alluded to kind of first wave or second wave. I think you wouldn't necessarily assume that people are going to behave the same in a second wave versus the first wave. So I think, we do have to be open to results that are maybe a little bit different from what our preconceived notions were. But if they're reasonable and they help guide the parameterization that we've talked about with Paul, I think that's key. The one other thing that I'll just mention in passing is that, as it's said, it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. And it's true not just for forecasting, but when you talk to people about what they think and what they will do in the future, it's very hard for us to assess how we're going to feel in the future and what we're going to do. Something called the affect heuristic, which says you kind of respond and make assessments based on how you feel right now. It's hard to imagine how you're going to feel 3, 6, 12 months from now when the vaccine starts to roll out, and maybe you're looking at your pantry and it's filled with toilet paper and you're saying, like, what was I thinking? But basically, that's part of the art of market research, which is trying to understand and put people in the frame of mind of a different situation, which is key to getting some useful insights as to what might happen in the future.
Yeah, I see your point. I think it's interesting. You could probably do the same study 3 months apart and have different answers, and that would impact that flexibility on how the sales team is going to be structured and potentially how you're going to move forward.
To your point, it's a moving target.
Yeah, right. So Jing, I think a little bit about from a client's perspective is they hear all this great things, but then how do I get this done? How do I operationalize? What do you recommend, and how do you guide a client in terms of getting this to actually work for them?
Yeah. So besides the regular like Salesforce design work we normally do, so for this work we actually addressing 3 key points with our clients that's not normally being considered super important before. So the very first one is actually the ongoing monitoring. So we talk a lot about flexibility, like how adaptive our plan can be. So the flexibility and adaptivity are all relying on like the work doesn't complete right at the launch. So we actually like the success of the whole project actually requires ongoing monitoring post-launch. So clients need to closely tracking the COVID impact, understand and knowing how their product and the market actually evolves as time goes by. So they are able to continuously measure it against their initial assumptions, measure it against their forecasting, identify gaps, and constantly revisit and adjust their plan accordingly. So this is super important. In order to really leverage flexibility, you have to really know like what's happening in your market and what you need to react based on the market dynamics. And the second thing is like Greg mentioned about like the open-mindedness. So for like launching at COVID, you actually need to be very open-mindedness regarding your engagement. You actually need to adopt innovative engagement in order to address all the difficulties we have identified with your customers. So Greg has mentioned like patient behavior change, physician behavior change, like physicians don't want to have face-to-face contacts. They probably have lower like receptiveness of products, and they don't have any capacity to really talking to a rep. And we also expect like with all the budget situation, like we're gonna facing a tougher payer situation. So this all requires pharma companies to start like instead of purely focusing on like sales rep face-to-face interaction, they actually need to leverage all available communication channels, focus on content creation, really strengthen their support they can offer to physician, to patient, while at the same time also develop a well-planned RWE strategy to help with some of the negotiation they have with payer. So innovative engagement is the second thing. And the third thing is really focus on communication. So the success of the plan requires cohesive effort between commercial ops, marketing, market access, like across the whole organization. And like based on different timeline, we have different focus. People's responsibility may change. So it is important, like everyone is clear with a roadmap, with the goals and the objectives we set at different stage, so that they are able to work all focusing on the same goal and be able to cohesively like making effort to achieve our success. Yeah. So that are the 3 things I think is very, very important for product launch during COVID.
So in other words, pay attention to what you're doing, keep an open mind about it, and get the message out. It sounds like what you have to do, right? All right, good. Yeah. Well, listen, I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I do want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So I'd like to just hit each of you with one last question. And you know, this all sounds great, but I'm sure there are some hurdles, some obstacles, some challenges that we face. So I'd be interested to hear from each of your perspective. Greg, I'd like to start with you on some what gets in the way of this, and how do you overcome it?
Yeah, I think, well, the one thing is that in market research in particular, it's not something that you can do overnight. So it requires some planning and anticipation of putting a program in place that can support issues that are, you know, critical to Salesforce design and alignment and I mean, adjustment and flexibility. So really getting ahead of the curve, having a strong program in place, or at least the ability to put it in place in a timely manner is key.
Right. And Jing, how about you?
I think it's a little bit similar as what Greg mentioned. So as I like oversee the whole project, like Greg also mentioned, market research cannot be done over time. Like also like Paul cannot like do the forecasting research like right at one night. So everything actually takes a lot of time and needs a lot of coordination, and especially like in between, like we need to have a lot of communication. We need to collect up insights from like external talking with customer, and also internally understand like what's client strategy, what's their biggest concern, like how are we able to build something customized for them to be able to address their concerns and answer their questions. So all this requires like a very flexible plan, while at the same time like really cohesive like project management and planning. So you really have to plan like first is to understand what are the key tasks you need to complete and what tasks can happen in parallel. And you really need to grab like for all the leadership, they need to know like when do you expect them to provide input, to grant approval, to help review sessions. So I think very good project planning. And as I mentioned, like the work haven't complete right at launch. It also requires a lot of ongoing planning post-launch. So I think one of the challenges is really to conduct like very good project management planning, and also be able to like shrink the previous like 12 to 24 months of a launch prep into this like 6 to 8 months timeline, to able to like incorporate all the COVID impacts and still like make sure your client is on time for their launch.
Got it. And from a forecasting perspective, Paul, I would imagine there's a lot of more perceived challenges than actual, just given the different approach that you're taking.
Yeah, actually, you know, it's an interesting question you raise, and I would actually, I think probably the biggest challenge, as I kind of hear, you know, Jing's and Greg's responses, is what I would call the silo approach. So many of these different areas are done in silos and done by completely different teams or different people. So the people who are doing forecasting are not the same people who are doing the targeting or doing the call planning or doing the alignment. And there's a lack of communication, obviously, often between these different areas. And that can create a significant challenge that I think ties into it. Again, you know, the people that are doing the market research perhaps are not communicating or talking with the people that are doing the forecasting and building it directly in. But there are things that are being thrown over the wall, thrown from one team to another team, without really seeing all the interconnectedness. And that interconnectedness, you know, I kind of talked a little bit on the forecasting side in terms of, does the promotional effort, is that actually directly built into the forecast? So that if you change an assumption of launching with 100 reps versus 120 reps 6 months down the line, does your forecast reflect that change? Okay, or is the forecast static regardless of what size sales force you have? Okay, that requires an interconnectedness between that conversation. And this whole concept of a flexible sales force to be able to account for, you know, a pandemic such as COVID or other issues that may occur with a specific product related to access or anything else, that interconnectedness becomes really, really important. So I think that's really the biggest challenge that we often face, is being able to help people to understand that there is an interconnectedness between all of these areas that is so vital to really getting the best outcome possible.
Yeah, I think, Paul, that's an interesting point, just given the discussion that we're having and how well connected that you are when you work together, and it's required that, you know, you have to know what each other is doing. Otherwise, it's, you know, less the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? Anyways, I think that will wrap it up in terms of our discussion points, but a few questions have come in that I'd like to address and get your input on. The first one that came in, I actually can take. It's who was the client that was done? Unfortunately, due to confidentiality, we cannot disclose that client's specific name, but what I can share is that it is an emerging pharmaceutical company based in the Northeast that we have worked with. The second question is, it's around cost. The question is, so I'm interested in understanding how much more this would cost than a more traditional approach, and how much longer it would take. Jing, do you want to start with that? You might be able to give some good insight into that.
So I think in terms of time, specifically for this work, it actually not taking additional time, because like for our client situation, like they really have a fixed timeline. Like they expecting like FDA approval at a certain time. They have to have all people in field finish recruiting at a certain timeline. So basically, like I wouldn't really think like using our approach will potentially push your launch timeline. So what we'll do is we try to understand like when we expect to have your launch, and we've actually like reverse it back to look at how are we able to accommodate and how are we able to leverage plan, have things happening at the same time to be able to make things all happen for you. And so in terms of timing and, in terms of cost, I don't think it's actually significantly also going to significantly increase the cost. So in actual, like in a traditional approach, KMK is doing for forecasting, like and also for sizing, we're never really giving a single point of estimate. We always recommend to have a range forecast, to have a range so that you are able to understand and you are able to make selection of different scenarios for different purposes, for like manufacturing purposes, for IC purposes. So like there's definitely different questions we are trying to addressing, like specific for COVID. However, I think from a cost perspective, like we don't really require a lot of additional investment because like we are trying to address in different questions. Yeah. Hope it answers the question.
Okay, thank you. That helps. Another question came in. It says we're in the middle of launch planning right now, and this is an interesting approach. How would we be able to pivot to include or accommodate this approach? Paul, do you want to, I think from your forecasting perspective, you might have some ideas there.
Sure. Let me just make sure I understood the question. So basically what you said is that they're in the middle of a launch, yeah, and they are wanting to know how to pivot to this different approach as opposed to the standard approach. Right. Okay. So what I would say is that every product is unique. So we don't have I do not recommend a boilerplate same approach for every product in every market. Mm-hmm. Some products and markets are impacted tremendously more by COVID than other ones. In terms of the approach, the detailed example that I gave in terms of the alignment, the approach is basically the same as what you would normally do in terms of kicking it off. You're going to ask for a proposal and an outline of what it would take. We will outline basically, in a statement of work, what would be done. Also, one of the things that I believe very strongly with and working very closely with KMK over many years is providing a lot of flexibility to try to help develop expertise within the company. Okay, if there's certain things that we're doing, I have no qualms about saying, okay, here's a forecast that I have to build, but now let's set up, instead of just a fixed price, forecast, and then we're set and done, to actually set up a retainer to say, okay, how could we help provide ongoing support for you to internalize some of that expertise or some of those things? The same thing can apply to other areas as well, to really give that flexibility to be able to develop. And where there's ongoing need for resources, obviously we can support that gladly. But really the pivoting to it is really helping management to understand the interconnectedness of the different areas and the advantage that you can gain by having a flexible approach. It's more of a communication, helping to understand by the executive leadership to switch to a different approach. We're not using different data. Obviously, we're using secondary data sources, and in many cases, we're using really good primary market research. If primary market research is needed, and Greg would be the first to tell you this, obviously there needs to have time to recruit a panel and to be able to get the information. But again, that's similar to what you would have. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that does. So we don't have any more questions that have come in, and we are about out of time. So I just wanted to thank each one of you for participating in this panel discussion. If anyone that has been watching this has any further questions that they'd wish to ask, please reach out. We'll be sharing this afterwards as well, so you'll be able to watch it again. It'll also be posted to be able to review it after the fact. So with that, I want to thank all of you and have a great day.
Thank you all.